Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could be with me tonight because I have an amazing author and a phenomenal book we're going to be talking about. And I like all the books that I read. I love many of them, but this one is so special. I actually have bought it for a number of people for gifts because I thought it was so amazingly well done. I have Scotty Roberts with us, and the book is Unearthing the Real History of Moses, and the Exodus from Egypt, among other things. It's a groundbreaking book, and the two authors re-examine humanity's most enduring account of bondage, emancipation, and freedom. The Great Exodus is the story of how one man, empowered by divine epiphany, brought the mighty ancient kingdom of Egypt to its knees. For thousands of years, the story has bolstered the faithful of three major religions though little historical data confirms it. So the questions must be asked: did it ever really happen? Scotty is a historian, a theologian, and Ward, an archaeologist, Egyptologist, and anthropologist, dig deeply into historical records to answer the most vexing of questions, like, is there historical evidence for the biblical account of the Great Exodus? Was Moses a real person? Where is biblical Mount Sinai? What is the Ark of the Covenant? Where did it come from? Why did Moses write about the Septuagint and the Nephilim? Is there a Templar and Masonic connection to the events and personages in the story? Did the Exodus take place under Amenhotep II or the third, two pharaohs of the same royal house separated by two generations and 80 plus years? Or were Tutmosis III, Hatshepsut, and Amenhotep, son of Heapu, at the core of the action? The authors present two opposing yet strangely interfaced historical accounts for the Exodus, naming the historical paragraphs and surprising candidates for historical Moses, while Roberts presents an account that finds its moorings in the efficacy of scriptural history. Ward presents a new and completely unique theory for the Exodus and its cast of characters. This is a super book if you're at all interested in this time frame. I certainly urge you to read it because it doesn't read like it's a book that's trying to educate you. It almost reads like a novel. So you get caught up in everything that's going on and you want more. And, they tease you. They don't give you everything, but it's phenomenal. And I highly recommend you get it. Welcome to the show, Scotty.
Barbara, thanks for having me, and thank you for that. And I will say, all those names, if you haven't practiced them for years, they're trippy.
to say the least. I mean, some of them aren't that bad, but it's Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut. Okay.
She was the female pharaoh of Egypt in the 18th dynasty. Her birth name was Matkare, and her regnal name was Hatshepsut.
Didn't she take notes from Sobanefru?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I do believe, though, as long as we're mentioning her right away,
Yeah.
if you look at the biblical account of the birth of Moses and the basket down the Nile and ends up in the pool of the princess, who is known as, the Bible only refers to her as Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah.
There's an interesting thing is that there were only 2 different Egyptian princesses who bore the royal title were Pharaoh's daughter. And so Hatshepsut was one of them, Matkare. So that was, I think, and we can look at this a little more later if you want, I believe that was Moses' homage to this woman, was to refer to her by her title, Pharaoh's daughter. So it's
Gotcha. Well, I just, there's so many different generations of pharaohs and Ramses and all of those. It's kind of hard to kind of keep everybody in their right place.
It is. And there are, here's the interesting thing, is that when you're trying to establish a dating system, which is what I built my theory on for the dating of Moses and being able to place him in alignment with certain historical characters, was that there are 4 different chronologies of the kings of Egypt. There's the accepted Oxford chronology of the kings of Egypt, and 3 others. And then along there's another guy who is very well known out there, David Rohl, who created his own version of the chronology of the kings based on his own theories and so on. And one of my old seminary professors, sorry, David Rohl, if you're listening to this, my old seminary professor said, "Oh, yes, we were talking about Moses." He says, "Oh, David Rohl. We like to refer to him as Roly-Poly." He's an older guy, so that's funny for him. But that's because I think he lost a lot of respect in academic circles because while he has a huge following and audience, and he's a scholar, and I respect him, there are things that I've learned from him. I think I disagree with him on the chronology of the kings of Egypt. So anyway.
Well, there's not really, I mean, I can see how there's a problem. And when you have an event like the Exodus, you would like to think that somewhere in the history of some of the other cultures that were around there would have been a mention to it. And
I think, here's what I think is there is a ton of references to the Exodus. The problem that we start with, one of the very basic problems, is that the Egyptians were not ones to record their defeats and their problem issues. You didn't have a pharaoh that would write on the wall of his temple, and these slaves kicked my ass and took off. That just didn't happen. And so I think the beginning point with all of that is that the Egyptians didn't keep records of it, but there are scant records of it. There are, and then you start moving out from Egypt, and there are all sorts of references to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, and so on. You have a lot of people out there that are, I would call them your biblical minimalist scholars that would like to minimize Israel as having been a viable nation at the time they were. But there is a lot of dating systems, a lot of archaeology that proves that they were. And a lot of them are like, well, you never had destructions of cities in Canaan and the Negev during the time period of the Bronze Age. And it's like, well, yeah, you did. And you just got to dig deeper. And so these are some of the things I've been finding out and learning. Here, I'll give you one little tidbit. Nah, I got to start getting into the whole dating system if I do this. So you tell me when to, you release the hounds and I'll go. So,
Well, I think one of the major things that is so impressive is that, you think that, what came first? I mean, you have the Jews, you have the Hebrews, and you have the Christians,
right.
and they all follow the same God.
They
but
do.
but which came first? I mean, is it the Israelites? Is it?
I believe this is that you did not have codified Judaism until Moses himself codified it. We think of the Ten Commandments. That's the law.
Yeah.
But Moses wrote half of the Pentateuch. The 5 books of Moses are talking about the law and establishing the worship, establishing the law for Israel. And so what Moses did was he codified Judaism, which did not really exist prior to the time of Moses. What you had was if you will, a proto-Judaism that existed prior to that. The basics, the fundamentals of what became Judaism. You had a Hebraic religion, Canaanite religion, if you will. People like to refer to what is now Israel and that region as Palestine. That was not. That was Roman.
Yeah.
Where that word came from. But it was the Canaanites were where the tribe of Abram lived, where you had the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel that migrated into Egypt during the time of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Yeah.
So, there are lots of names. They had religions. There was an interesting thing. If you look in the book of Job, chronologically, one of the oldest books in the Old Testament, the book of Job, and we all know about the trials of Job, and all of that and we don't have to get into that story, but Job and his friends are debating, and he mentions the 3 constellations, the 7 sisters,
Yeah.
I can't think of it off the top of my head, but he mentions 3 constellations, which are the 3 constellations which were consistent with all the ancient Sumerian religions.
Yeah.
And things like that. So you've got early biblical Hebraic religion sprouting from religion that was much, much older. And I believe Moses, when he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, that Moses took a lot of information from pre-Hebraic cultures, the Sumerian cultures in Mesopotamia, in the Euphrates River Valley region, which is now today Iran and Iraq. And he took a lot of their information and extrapolated it over into what and this is because this is what he would have learned growing up in the palace of the pharaohs and growing up in the school of the nobles. This is the kind of education he would have.
But they were monotheistic. They weren't. No, they were polytheistic.
Polytheistic. As a matter of fact, I think, there was a point I said as I was studying all of this to write this book, is that you would find that it seems that the God of the Old Testament, the very Old Testament, because you actually have 2 gods mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And you have Elohim and you have Jehovah.
Mm-hmm.
And those come across as distinctive, separate characters. Now,
Absolutely.
Elohim is the name used for God almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament. And so, like Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai, all of these names were variations of El, which was the base name in the Hebrew language for the word God, El. Of course, you have the meaning of the word Elohim used almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament to describe who God is is a plural word. Elohim. Him being a plural suffix tacked on the end of a word to denote plurality. Like the term Nephilim. It's Nephalhim. It's denoting Nephal is the singular, Nephalhim is the plural. The same angels. Melach is singular, Melochim is plural. Then you've got El is the name for God, but Elohim is the name used for God. I think it's about 2,700 times in the Old Testament. And so you have to ask the question, well, who was this guy? Because the word literally translated means Elohim is God among many gods, or of many gods.
Yeah.
And so you had to start looking at that and say, who is this guy?
Yeah. So when you get to the juicy stuff here,
Yeah.
Your compatriot makes logical sense about putting a baby in a basket in the Nile.
Sure he does.
You know, there were alligators there.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
I have an answer to that.
okay.
First of all, my very dear friend, and I would call him my dearest friend in the world, John Ward. We wrote this book together, and he passed away about 5 weeks ago. So he's no longer with us. So I'll do my best to represent his very flawed theory. He used to write, we'd do book signings together, and he'd say, he's a British archaeologist, by the way. He and his wife, Swedish, they had a big archaeological mission. She still does. Obviously, it's only been 5 weeks, but of Gebel El Silsila, which is one of the biggest quarry sites, about 500 miles south of Cairo, about 100 miles south of Luxor, in the Komombo district, and they've got 23 square miles of archaeological site, which is all desert, and where all these stones were quarried and sent on ships up to Luxor and built all the grand temples and so on. But so John would say to me, we'd be at a book signing, and he'd sign his name on the inside cover, and then he'd say, by the way, he says, my brother Scotty has an amazing theory on Moses, and it will knock your socks off. Go to page 286 to read it. And then you'd flip over to 286. It's the blank page in the back, and he would just take his pen and write 286 dot, Scotty's theory. And so we went round and round about our theories. My theory is very biblically based in the sense that I adhere to the believing that there is efficacy in the historical structure of Scripture. John was more minimalist and believed that there were a lot of archetypes. And so his guy for Moses was a guy named Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, who was a grand vizier. His was about 80 years later than my theory. And he thought the Exodus was based on the destruction of the man-made Lake Malkata south of Luxor, which flooded the town of Luxor on the west bank and left a lot of people killed and so on. And that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, led the people out of the land and so on. And to me, there were a lot of things I could not agree with John on because I just thought it was too minimalistic. It was too far from, it was too much trying to get away from the items in Scripture that give you a pretty good roadmap, which is what I used for my definition of who Moses was. Now, I believe Moses was a man named Senenmut, and he lived in the 18th dynasty. He lived and was raised to great power by the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut was the daughter of Tutmosis I. And Tutmosis I had a son, Tutmosis II, who he married off to his daughter, which is what they did to keep the royal lines clean back then.
Right.
And he died. He was weak and sickly, and he passed away. They had a daughter together who died at about age 16. And but before that daughter died, Hatshepsut had brought into the royal palace a man named Senenmut. And Senenmut was not his given name. Senenmut in the in the Egyptian, means mother's brother. I, your mother, am bestowing on you the title of brother to the gods with me, and elevating him in spiritual status. She also conferred on this guy 92 different royal titles. He was everything from the high priest of Amun to the grand royal architect to the grand vizier. Grand vizier in Egypt basically meant pharaoh in the place of pharaoh. If pharaoh was off on campaign, grand vizier was the pharaoh. So this is this guy. And how I arrived at this date and landing on him is thusly. In the Bible, you can go to a verse in the book of 1 Kings in the Old Testament. 1 Kings 6:1 states that in the 480th year after the Exodus, Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem. Temple 1. Now, we happen to know Solomon being the son of King David.
Yep.
And there's controversy on whether or not Solomon even lived by your minimalists and your scholars. They go back and forth. But Solomon dated, and the temple is dated very clearly to around 966 BCE. You can't excavate at the Temple Mount today because of the Dome of the Rock, but they've excavated all around it. They've had things come out of there where the Muslims have gone under what was the old temple compound where the Dome of the Rock stands now, and hauled all kinds of dirt out of it. They've done their own excavating under there, and they just put it in piles. And a football field away from the Dome of the Rock. And so it's wide open. Anybody can go in there and do whatever they want. It's piles of garbage and debris.
Yeah.
And they have spent 10 years sifting through those piles and have found over, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, over 55,000 Temple 1 artifacts. So, Temple 1, built in 966 BC. Bible says in 1 Kings, on the day that Solomon dedicated that temple in Jerusalem, 966, it was the 480th year since the Exodus. And if you do your backwards math, you end up with 1446 BCE as the date of the Exodus. So then your next step is, well, how can we quantify this date? Is there efficacy to this date? And you start digging around and you find in your history, you will find that you just go to the chronology of the kings of Egypt. And there's 4 different ones. And they only zoom, though, about 20 to 40 years back and forth, depending on whether a particular establisher of one of the chronologies said, well, this king reigned for 40 years, not 20, and he had a co-regent. That co-regent reigned 18 years, so we're changing the timeline. It shifts around a bit.
Yeah.
The timeline that I use is closest to the Oxford accepted chronology of the kings, and it's off by a few years here and there. But you will find that the pharaohs of Egypt that match the story of Moses in the Old Testament and the Exodus, all seem to fit very well with that dating system. And so you have Hatshepsut. She was about 40 years old in 1446 BC. Her grand vizier, Senenmut, was about 40 years old at what would be the date of the Exodus. That's not the only thing. You start going through all the different little details. You go back 40 years to the birth of Moses, you have 1526 BC. And Moses is born. Matkare, Hatshepsut, later in life, the queen, she was roughly 7 to 10 years old at the time the Moses in the basket story would have taken place. And Matkari bore a royal title. Her royal title was only given to a couple of different women throughout the Egyptian chronology of kings and queens, and that was Pharaoh's daughter. How does Moses refer to her in the book of Exodus when he writes about this woman that bore him out of the Nile? Pharaoh's daughter. And I think that's an homage to her, even though he doesn't mention the names. Well, what does the Bible story tell us? It says that Moses' sister followed along and came up to the young princess and said, I can take him back to his mother. He's the child of Hebrew slaves, and I'll take him back to his mother, have him weaned until you're ready to bring him into the palace. And so she agrees to this. And in the Hebrew, the Jewish Bibles, it talks about how she went, and when she was old enough to claim him, she brings him back into the palace. And the big question, you said about alligators or crocodiles more accurately down there, is here's the thing about the location of where these things took place. You've got Luxor, which is this beautiful city filled with all these beautiful temples. You can go to the temple of Hatshepsut, and you can see all these, but they're funerary temples on the west bank. Luxor, or ancient Thebes as it was known, was down in the south. But the place where Moses would have been born would have been, remember the Bible talks about how the Hebrews under Joseph, a few hundred years earlier, had been given the land of Goshen, they called it.
Yeah.
What is east of what is now Cairo, if you go into the Nile Delta region. It's where the Nile goes all the way up to Cairo, and then it splits off into the Delta Fan. And you go a little bit east, and you end up at what was known as Goshen, that land. And so and by the way, Goshen was the center of mud brick making during the reigns of these pharaohs.
Okay.
And so when they wanted mud bricks, which we know the Hebrews made mud bricks in the story with that, they all came out of Goshen. And some interesting things about Goshen. You can go there to that region today, and this branches off into so many different places, but this goes with the dating of the Exodus, and I believe that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was not Ramses II, which you see in Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, Moses, the Ten Commandments, all these great movies out there that are done, always placing under the reign of Ramses. Well, that's because there's a little verse at the end of the book of Genesis, as it's setting up the enslavement of the Hebrew people in Egypt, that talks about, and the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Ramses, Pi-Ramses, and Pithom and Ramses, the treasure cities of Pharaoh Ramses. Well, what's interesting about that, that's what the Bible says. So everybody went for centuries saying, well, obviously the Bible says that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But that's not really so. Because what you've got to keep in mind something about Egypt, is all these pharaohs were great usurpers of cities, villages, monuments, statues, temples that came before them. And they all would scrape off the images of the old Pharaoh and chisel in and paint their images on these temples. And if you look at almost all, and by the way, it was a thing called erasure. And because they would erase the previous Pharaoh, not to do dishonor to his name, but to say, I need this temple for my stuff. And if you look at the, and I've been there, you put your hands in it, all the inscriptions of Ramses II on his temples were twice as deep as any of the older pharaohs.
Wow.
You know why he did that? He dug these things, his hieroglyphics were 4 inches deep. Why? Because you couldn't scrape them off.
Oh, wow.
So Ramses II, far too late in history to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, even though the Bible says the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. What does that mean? It means Pithom and Ramses used to be known, or Pi-Ramses, used to be known as the city of Avaris. And Avaris was the Hebrew city of all these Mesopotamian peoples, these Middle Eastern peoples that for about 800 years had migrated into the Nile Delta. And if you remember the story of Joseph, where his brothers sell him into slavery, they're from Canaan.
Yeah.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is his father. And the 12 tribes were represented by his brothers while they sell him into slavery. Nice brothers. And 20 years later, there is famine in Canaan. And so his brothers totally, they don't know whatever happened to Joseph. Joseph's long dead to them, 20 years ago. They go to Egypt to ask permission to move into the Nile Delta, this Goshen region, and others. And this had been going on for 600, 700, 800 years. You had people migrating to the Nile Delta from the Canaanite region, what is now Israel and Mesopotamia and so on. They were known as the Asiatics, they were called by the Egyptians. And so Joseph's brothers all show up. Who is the Grand Vizier? Their brother Joseph. And they have no idea he's even alive, don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And we all know that story.
Yeah.
And so Joseph ends up, under the Pharaoh's permission, giving them the land of Goshen. And so Goshen is where they established the city, and they built the city of Avaris. And Avaris, if you, right now you go to what is now today, what's known as Pi-Ramses, you start digging and you find Avaris. Avaris, it's all cornfields and stuff like that, but you start walking through and you're stumbling over big feet of statues projecting out of the dirt, heads and columns and all of this. And so they're excavating there, but they're very careful because there's a political thing here. Egypt doesn't want to give Israel any, at least this is the old terms that they used to operate under, was they didn't really want to give Israel any claim to the land by saying, well, Avaris was a city built by us. And so they wouldn't allow excavation. And if they found out you were excavating to try to establish the story of Moses, they'd cut you off. Everything was reburied. And so, but that city now exists. So when the Bible says the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses under this Pharaoh, what they're saying is they built the city of Avaris, and it was Ramses that usurped those cities and renamed them as his treasure cities. And we know this because there were not accurate records back then. I mean, hell, the Israelites a few hundred years later couldn't even remember where the Mount Sinai was.
Yes.
And so they had no recollection of these things historically. And there's reasons for that. But so, and I veered off of this, the crocodiles in the Nile thing.
Yeah.
I believe that Avaris was the city that was built by the Hebrews. Joseph had his palace there as the Grand Vizier. As a matter of fact, it's been uncovered. Now, it doesn't say Joseph lived here, but there are several things mentioned in the ruins that point to the description of his palace. It talks about the palace having the 12 pillars representing his brothers. It talks about his brothers were all buried there in their tombs, and there's 13 tombs on the
Wow.
compound of this palace. There's this smashed statue that many scholars, even non-biblical scholars, start to think, well, this could very well be the Joseph of the Bible. It's a statue. He's painted with yellow skin, which is how they painted Asiatics from Canaan and all of that. He's wearing a striped cloak of red, black, yellow, white, this coat of many colors.
Yeah.
He's got his arms crossed. He's got the crook and the flail, which are symbols of high office. And he's got this, what they call the mushroom wigs. It's the big Egyptian wig that comes out like this and
Yeah.
cuts back in. It's painted red. So red-haired wig. And it's smashed to pieces. Now, they've reconstructed it. And you find this character on there, dating back to the period of the Hyksos. What would be the Hyksos period? Now, we've all heard about the Hyksos, maybe. They reigned for 108 years because they took over the northern kingdom of Egypt, and all the Egyptians reigned from the southern kingdom. The interesting thing about this is that it wasn't an invasion. It was for about 700 to 800 years, all these Asiatics migrating into the Delta region, dwelling in the cities, becoming part of the northern Egyptian life, participating in municipal duties and offices and all that. And eventually, they just took over northern Egypt and reigned as their own pharaohs for 108 years. Now, the reason, and it wasn't until Moses I, who ousted them out of Egypt, slapped them in irons, the remnants of them, and his son was Tutmosis I, who was the grandfather of, or the father of Hatshepsut, who was the young woman who found Moses in the Nile. And so you've got all these peoples up there, the Hyksos, you got Joseph. There's a very interesting verse in the book of Genesis talking about Joseph. Once he's revealed himself to his brothers, I'm the grand vizier from Egypt. That beautiful verse teaching the lesson, that he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
Yeah.
And I'm here now to save your lives. And he tells them, I'm going to take you in to meet Pharaoh. Now, when you go in, this is in the story in Genesis. When you go in, he says, I want you to tell Pharaoh that you are shepherds and you've been shepherds since the days of your youth. Why? Because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, why is he telling them to tell the Pharaoh of Egypt that they're shepherds because the Egyptians hate shepherds? Well, that is a clean-cut historical clue to what's going on. The Hyksos were not Egyptians. The Hyksos were hated by the Egyptians who reigned in the south, who eventually drove them out. And so he's saying, basically, is this. These pharaohs, the Pharaoh of Egypt right now on the throne in northern Egypt, which was Memphis, or Mennefer as it was known back then, it's just about 30 miles south of modern-day Cairo. This was the northern capital of Egypt that they took over, that this Pharaoh would have looked at these brothers of Joseph and said, you're shepherds? We're all brothers. We're kindred spirits. We're all kin. And given them the land because they were all related. They all came from the same place. You've heard of the Hyksos, by the way, which is a looser Egyptian word that meant the shepherding kings. And so this is who Joseph was.
Okay.
How the Hebrews got there, or what the Canaanites, it was actually not even the Canaanites. It was the family of Jacob, about 77 people. And they eventually became the Canaanites and so on. And this is how the bondage started, because they were driven out, and the rest of them were forced into bondage or forced into servitude. This is the city of Avaris, where they would have lived, and they found many, many, many housing structures in the what would you call it? It's like the cookie cutter archaeological ruins. You're not finding whole houses; you're finding foundations, and that were all Hebraic in style, or I'm sorry, Canaanite in style, and all these stories. Now the crocodiles. Back to the crocodiles. What happened up in Memphis,
Yeah.
the city, the northern capital of Egypt? They dug all the great canals off the Nile, the royal canal of the pharaohs that crisscrossed that whole region from Memphis, which is, if you have the Nile Delta sitting here like this, Memphis right down here, then Cairo's right here today. All these cities spread around, and their road system was the canals they dug. And there was the Grand Canal of the Pharaohs that went right out of Memphis and right out into the desert, and some of the other to Avaris. It's interesting. There's a verse in the Bible that says, and Moses met with Pharaoh, and they had an argument, and Moses, and it says, and Moses turned on his heel and went back to Avaris, it's his Goshen, and spoke to the Hebrew leaders that same night. Now, if they're raining from down in Luxor, that by car is almost an 8-hour drive, by plane an hour and a half. And then you have, so you're way up there in Mennefer is where this all took place, Memphis. And this is where it was. And how did they get around? How did Moses get from the palace of Pharaoh, even in Memphis, to Goshen the same day? The royal canal of the Pharaoh. And they took their boats back and forth through here. And it was about you'd say almost I'd figure a 5 to 10 hour trip, depending on several different factors. And so the crocodiles in the Nile would have been kept out of the royal canals of the Pharaoh, although they could be there. And all these little crisscrossing canals, they had to be careful still. But why would Moses have ended up in the pool of the Pharaoh's daughter if he's being drifted down the main channel of the Nile River? Well, he wasn't drifted down the main channel. His older sister, Miriam, and mother, who took, and remember, it doesn't say they floated him down the Nile. The Bible says in the book of Exodus, and they placed his basket amongst the reeds along the banks of the Nile. And who should be there but Pharaoh's daughter bathing in her pool? So what did they do? I think they knew to save Moses' life. They took this basket, they placed it in the canal of the Pharaohs, maybe even a side canal that went to the palace in Memphis, where the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, had her little swimming pool, that hooked up bathing pool, and they took their water from the Nile, of course. And her servants find this basket amongst the reeds. And she brings the baby in. She has compassion on him, takes him in. And then it's, of course, Moses' older sister who says, hey, I know whose baby that is, trying to save his life because of the edict of Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Pharaoh had put out the edict that all babies 2 years and under would be killed because they believed in the prophecies of all these other gods. Why not the God of the Canaanite people?
Yeah.
Who said there's a deliverer that's coming. And so he said, well, we'll nip that in the bud. We'll kill all these babies. And what's interesting about that story and the whole thing about Moses is that you have scoffers and those who don't believe the story was true, scholars, that will say, well, that's just a recreation of the Osiris story, where he's cut
Yeah.
up into bits and floated down the basket of the Nile, and all of these things about the story. And yet, remember what I said about the Hebrews at this time? They weren't Jews. They had
No.
a form of an ancient proto-Judaic religion that more than likely believed in Elohim and all these other gods that Moses codified. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, the first commandment. Well, that's not a kitschy phrase. That's all these other gods. That's not me. You will me as God. So, if you don't think for a minute that Moses' Hebrew mother did not know all these mythologies of the Egyptians, the religions of the Egyptians, they were raised in Egypt. They were very Egyptianized at the
Yeah.
time Moses came to power.
Well,
And so she was mimicking the story of Osiris to latch the young princess.
well, you've got Moses, and then you've got the vizier for the Pharaoh's daughter. How do you,
Okay.
change
The
of
way,
name?
the way I put that together
Yeah.
is that the Exodus took place in 1446, the Bible says. It says Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. Not the movies always depict him younger and, oh, my hair turned white because of the power of God. No, he was 80 years old. And you go back 80 years, you end up at the same date that Hatshepsut found this baby in the Nile. And she finally takes this baby in probably 3 or 4 years later, by about the age of 12, when she can legally accept him. And she takes this young baby in. She renames him Senenmut. And all these royal titles she gives him as he grows up. According to Jewish scriptures, he becomes a phenomenal general in the Egyptian armies.
Yeah.
There was no hiding his Egyptian or his Hebrew heritage. They didn't care. Like the movies play that up like it's a big deal. No big deal. If Pharaoh says, hey, that Hebrew kid is now mine. Okay, yes, Morning Star. It's whatever the Pharaoh said. And so the way I start linking Moses is more by, you don't have any particular scripture or historical document that says Senenmut was Moses, Moses was Senenmut.
Yeah.
But you do have correlations. And all these historical correlations start coming out when you start digging into it. By the time Senenmut would have been raised to great power under Hatshepsut, he became the tutor to the royal daughter beneath Hatshepsut. And you think, oh, so Moses was a school marm? No, the Egyptians would not have anybody be a tutor to the pharaonic children that was not either an established heroic general or some great noble figure in Egyptian history. So that's who this guy was, Senenmut. She raises him to power. There are circumstantial evidences. We don't know who Senenmut's parents were. We don't know what his real name was. All we know is that Pharaoh's daughter, who we can establish historically, was the one who was once his mother and has now established him as her brother to the gods. That might have been very early on. And we find that, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, Senenmut built 3 glorious tombs for himself. One of them is right on the site of Deir el-Bahre in Luxor, which is the funerary temple of Djeser-Djeseru that he built for Hatshepsut. He's the Grand Royal Architect. Right on the same property. There's all this information that Senenmut and Hatshepsut were lovers. And when there's a right around the time that Hatshepsut dies, Senenmut disappears off the scene of Egypt and completely, totally gone. No mention of him, no mention of his execution or murder. But what happens? The Pharaoh, they say, who took over, which was, now this is interesting all in itself. She had a son, or she had a daughter that Senenmut was the tutor of. She did not have a son. A harem daughter had the son. The son's name was Tutmosis III. Tutmosis III was sent up to Mennefer, where he led all the armies of Pharaoh Hatshepsut. And he was her stepson. He was the rightful Pharaoh, but he was a stepson. Hatshepsut came in and usurped that, made him a co-regent, then made him the general of all of her armies, and it was a peaceful reign. He never led a revolt against her, nothing. But as soon as she's dead, he comes in and takes his rightful place, Tutmosis III. And he scrapes all of her images off of her temples. And they found more recently, the last 20, 30 years, they found that all the images of Senenmut were also scraped off the temples, except for the ones that were inside the Holy of Holies at her temple, because these big doors would open up, and there was, his cartouche was done on the corner of each hinge plate, and they just missed those. And so you've got all this information about, they find 9 statues of Senenmut buried in Luxor, and they unbury these, and Senenmut, the friend of the queen, all of these things that really establish his relationship with her. And there's a lot of other things, but what you take is mostly the circumstantial dating evidence. And I say, I kind of put this out there, and this is kind of my theory, is that you look at like Queen Elizabeth I, who had all these courtiers, all these men who thought they should be the rightful pharaoh in her place, or king of England in her place, the woman reigning in the place of a king. This was Hatshepsut. She was a woman reigning in the place of a king. She had all these courtiers. I'm sure she had all these factions. I know she had all these factions just waiting for her to die or whatever.
Yeah.
I have this theory that the taskmasters, as Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and he goes with his entourage, it says, he's with his entourage. He's Prince of Egypt. Well, that, by the way, it's one of the titles that Hatshepsut gave Senenmut, the hereditary crown prince of Egypt, she names him. And so he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, murders him, buries him in the sand. Well, then the Hebrews find out.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing behind this. That Moses, I think, was somebody who was trained to be a pharaoh, went through the school of the nobles, and he knew he was a Hebrew, and he was establishing himself. He thought, I could establish myself as the king of the Hebrews. And I think this was part of his ambition and so on. And you see it later in Moses' life, though. By the way, this doesn't establish fact that Senenmut was Moses, but later in Moses' life, all through his time, you see Moses camps outside the camp, away from the people. Moses establishes himself as, there's one point where God says, I want you to strike the rock and water will gush out to give the people water. And Moses doesn't strike the rock. God says to speak to it. And he strikes it again, as he had done before. He was establishing the fact that God and I are on a par with each other. When it said that he pitched his tent outside the camp, it would say, and the Shekinah glory of God would come down as a cloud and settle on the tent of Moses. And there Moses would meet with God face to face, as a man talks to his friend. And then 9 verses later in the same chapter, it says, and no man shall see God's face and live. Well, was Moses not a man? No, I believe Moses, when he was writing that, was establishing that I am my mother's brother. I am an equal brother to the gods as I was in Egypt. And so now that's circumstantial. There's all kinds of circumstantial things that point to Senenmut being this son, being this man who was elevated to power by the Pharaoh, and the dating system all fits the Exodus 14:46. Moses is 80. It says he lives for another 40 years. They enter the land of Canaan, the promised land. What's the first act after Moses dies and Joshua takes over the armies of Israel, leads them into the land? They sack the city of Jericho. Jericho, we all know the old, I'll say it this way because it's what it's called, the old Negro spirituals.
Yep.
Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. That story.
Yeah.
And you've got that city taking. Now, you can go to the name's slipping, to tell, not, I mean, the archaeological hill site of the ruins of Jericho today. Kathleen Kenyon and archaeologists of 100 years ago all did the excavations there. They found the walls tumbled out. They found all this stuff. But what they did find and established was that the city of Jericho was destroyed around 1405 BCE. Now, if the Exodus took place by the biblical narrative in 1446, you go down 40 years, you got 1405 to 1406 BCE as the destruction of Canaan, or Jericho. That city was not inhabited again for 850 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, in 1405, guess who comes to the Pharaoh's throne about 125 years later? Ramses II. So Ramses wasn't even alive at the time of the Exodus or the sacking of Jericho, which is a keystone date. So now Senenmut, the way to establish, there is so much information that establishes, and I will admit, I admitted in the book, that this is circumstantial, but everything about Senenmut matches. I had one scholar take me to task after the book came out. Oh, that's Scotty Roberts. He doesn't know what he's talking about, because it wasn't Senenmut. It was obviously a servant of Senenmut who killed the Egyptian taskmaster. It's like, I don't care. It's right in the same time spot. And so you had all this destruction of Senenmut's images, all of the burial of his statues. All of this happened at the same time. Why? To show that Tutmosis III was the rightful pharaoh in the place of Hatshepsut. And then he became pharaoh for almost 40 years. Wait, I'm getting my timelines mixed up. After Moses fled, Moses comes back 40 years later, 80 years old as Senenmut comes back. He's recognized in the biblical story. And you have Tutmosis III has now been reigning for 40 years. He's in his 80s. In his dotage, he becomes co-regent with his son, Amenhotep II. And Amenhotep II is 18 years old when he takes the throne. He would have been 25 years old at the time of the Exodus in 1446. Arrogant, braggadocious. He led 5 successful military campaigns before the date of the Exodus. And this man, after these 5 successful military campaigns, chases down his Hebrew slaves. And you find that it's almost a dozen years before Amenhotep II ever had a military campaign. Why? He lost his armies in the closing of the Red Sea. And there's all kinds of other information. Now, can I establish for a fact that Senenmut is Moses? Or that
Yep,
Moses
you got
is
me.
Senenmut? I can't. There's no documentation. All you have is what we started referring to as secondhand documentation. All of these archaeological correlations that show that this is who this man was. And
So let's get to another juicy subject.
yeah,
Okay, the Exodus.
yeah.
How did they gather that many people together overnight?
Well, I think that there is, first of all, I think that there are some numerical mistranslations. I don't think it was 2 million people. It talks about 200,000 Hebrew men with their wives and their children and their cattle and all of this. I think the first thing you can do to speculate a bit is
Okay, you froze. Boo-ha, boo-ha. It's a long freeze. Well, Scotty seems to have left us. I suspect he's going to be coming back because I'm very curious about the Exodus. So we're going to let him come back in. I have to admit, circumstantially, he has me convinced as to the real personage that became Moses. I think it bothers me so much that people change their name in midstream all over the place, and it's really hard for me to keep them all up, to say nothing of being able to pronounce half of them. But as I read through this book, it brought a lot of the stories and the people to life to a greater degree than ever before. So I think that we're going to have to he may be back. Did you have a nice trip?
Died. I didn't realize it wasn't plugged in.
Oh my goodness. Oh, those pesky little things like electricity.
I'm not hearing you. Hold on a second. Hopefully you can do some fancy editing.
Sure.
There we go. All right.
So you were beginning to talk. We were beginning to talk about the Exodus and how
the Exodus. I think these people. First of all, we got to remember they all were in servitude to the Egyptians. They all not only made mud bricks, they tended cattle, they did all these things. They had whole villages.
Yeah.
And I believe that they were given the heads up, of course. What did Moses tell them? Here's what I want you to do. Bake a bunch of unleavened bread. Don't let it rise. Don't take the time. Gather one belonging. Just gather your stuff. Throw it in the cart. Let's go. Be ready to go. And so all of this took place in the overnight. The angel of death came. And that's another interesting thing because Amenhotep II had a son, but it was not his firstborn son. And the prophecies or some of the scriptures said, why did his son, or he had a firstborn son and his son died. And there's all kinds of archaeological records that show his firstborn son died, and it was second-born son that took over when he died. So the Exodus, it's as simple as saying you've got a bunch of people who had the ability to pack up their wagons and go. And if it was 200,000 people, I don't think it was that many. But these people, did I lose you again?
No, I'm here.
Oh, there it is. Something popped up in front of me. And I, of course, am not wearing my glasses, so I didn't quite make that out right away. But so all these people packed up, and Moses said, "Be ready to run." And they ran. And they went out into the desert. And they started taking this path toward the Red Sea. And they end up getting cornered in a place where they could not cross the sea. And Pharaoh's armies are chasing them. Now, how many days went by between this? I don't know. Because remember, Pharaoh comes in and he says, "Where are all my slaves?" And he mounts up his army. Now, I have a theory about this. I'm going to give you a theory I don't think anybody's ever expounded on before. I have this theory. Okay. Remember I said a grand vizier was a pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh? I believe when Moses, as Senenmut, was the grand vizier to Hatshepsut, he was the pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. I believe he grew up with a man named Rechmir, who also became a grand vizier after the time of Senenmut. He became the grand vizier, stepped right in, became the grand vizier after the time of Senenmut. But he was just as old as Senenmut. He's 83 years old at the time of the Exodus, Rechmir. And Rechmir would have been the grand vizier to the pharaoh at this time, Amenhotep II. And Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh, what did he do? He ruled as Pharaoh. He had all the power of Pharaoh. And what do you have taking place the first 5 years of the reign of Amenhotep II, who I believe is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? 5 military campaigns. Gone. Then you have the Exodus take place. You got all these conflicts going on between Moses and Pharaoh. Now, keep in mind, theory, speculation.
Yeah.
All these, I believe that during the time of the plagues and the confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh, that this was not Amenhotep II that Moses was facing. It was his old contemporary, Rechmir, the grand vizier, who is now sitting on the throne. And part of my speculation is that when Moses was elevated to power under Hatshepsut, he got overlooked. And there was this dastardly conflict and competition between them. So I also established that a little bit by saying that same line, "Where are all my slaves?"
Yeah.
You suddenly got Pharaoh standing in the courtroom saying, "Where are all my slaves?" And they're telling him, well, they took off under Moses. I don't think he was there. I don't think that was his decision to let them go. I think it was Rechmir's.
Oh.
And Rechmir, after that date, you never hear about him again. I visited his tomb. You can see it. It's got pictures of him, paintings on the wall that are 3,500 years old, holding a staff, and his taskmasters all beating Hebrew slaves around him. So there are things to establish his dating, but I believe, and it's a speculative belief, it's probably the stuff of writing a novel as opposed to establishing a scholarly record, because there's no real evidence for this. But all the implications seem to indicate that Pharaoh had no idea about this. And how could he mount up his, I can't remember the number, is 8,000 to 10,000 chariots strong to chase down these Hebrew slaves? How could he mount up his army? I think running off as ragtag slaves with your goat cart is going to be a hell of a lot easier than mounting up your army. Well, I think that's because they just came back from campaign. Pharaoh goes, where the hell are all my slaves? Finds out, says, whoa, calls the general, mount back up. And they run out to chase them down. Now, pure speculation on my part, that story. So, and then, of course, the whole scene with the Red Sea and so on. And so now, like I've said, I know one of the big things is establishing that Senenmut was the man. You can go in and establish all these dating systems, everything about the pharaohs around Senenmut, everything about every last single person that was in a royal situation around Senenmut, and how Senenmut was then also the grand vizier of the pharaoh who died. And somebody, what does the Bible say after Moses had killed the Egyptian? He fled because he said, Pharaoh is seeking my life.
Yeah.
And what do you got in the Hebrew scripture? It talks about in the Jewish Bible how, and Jewish writings and stories, how Moses had been a great general under the Pharaoh and how he had quelled a rebellion down in Ethiopia and how he had taken the queen for his own wife. And Pharaoh was like, sent a letter, you remember who you work for, get your butt back to Egypt. So he gets back to Egypt. According to the Jewish version of the story, Moses didn't flee east into the Sinai and the land of the Midianites, the land of Midian. He first went south to Ethiopia and grabbed his queen, the woman that he wanted to marry, takes her back up into Midian with him, ends up marrying the daughter of the high priest as well, Zipporah, in Midian, and this is a pagan high priest, and Moses marries his daughter. Why? I don't think that Moses was somebody that's very established between the lines, that he wasn't necessarily of the Judaic faith until all of this stuff happened. He took several wives. He became, I believe, a desert sheikh. And by the time 40 years later, he goes back to Egypt, he's making all these excuses to God in the burning bush. I can't go back to Egypt. Pharaoh's seeking my life. God says, the man who sought your life is dead. You can go back. It's safe for you. Well, I can't speak very well. I'm not very eloquent. God's like, well, who made your mouth? I did. And I think Moses was an excellent speaker. And it's borne out all through the scriptural tales. So he finally goes back to Egypt. And I believe, as I've already mentioned, he was recognized for who he was. The man that would have been his brother, like the Ramses character, would have been Tutmosis III. He was the stepbrother who was leading the generals under Hatshepsut up in the north, and so on. And
that's why he could walk in and out so easily.
That's why he could walk in and out. And it said that Pharaoh's court feared Moses. Why? He's the head of the Hebrews. What did they care? Hebrews are slaves. I think there was more to it than all of that. And I don't think they were all slaves. I think many of them were Egyptianized in, as I mentioned, under the Hyksos. And I believe Moses bore great respect when he came back. And the Pharaoh that sought his life, I don't necessarily believe through all the circumstances it was necessarily the Pharaoh as it was everybody around him. Now, you got to demand justice. You got to do this. All it would take, like we've seen in the movies, is the Pharaoh goes, I'm the morning and the evening star, and my word goes, Moses, you're exonerated. Poof. And so there's all kinds of very interesting tidbitty little archaeological information, historical information that points to Senenmut being Moses, that points to Tutmosis III being the contemporary of Moses and the father of the Pharaoh who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II. All of this information meshes together. Even the story of Senenmut and Hatshepsut, where she raises him to great power, all mesh together when he disappears off the scene right after she dies, meshes into the story. So I believe this was the man. And I also, a lot less, I don't mention this in the book at all, but a lot less scholarly grounded and more on the realm of esoterics. I had some things happen to me in Egypt when I was there that established for me, and again, you can't write this in a textbook. The author of this book had a vision, and therefore this is why we know Senenmut was. No, I was. We had put on these symposiums, and in 2012 I had the Paradigm Symposium. We had all these people come. Philip Coppens, who was part of the cast of Ancient Aliens in their earlier years, was one of our guest speakers. He actually wrote the foreword for my book on the reptilians. But he was a good friend, and he got sick. It was in October of 2012. He got sick. He told me, I'm not feeling well. I'm going to go back home and see what's up. And 2 months later in December, he had died of angiocarcinoma.
Yeah.
Now, the only reason this is relevant to what I'm going to tell you is that when I learned of his death on, it was, I believe it was December 30th. This is about 10 days before I'm leaving for Egypt for the first time ever. And I heard of his death and I began weeping, just weeping. I mean, it was uncontrollable. It was rolling off my chin. And every time I stopped weeping, it would start up again as soon as I thought of Philip. And I thought, what the hell is this? What's happening to me? Philip was a friend, but we weren't like getting a cottage by the seashore or anything together.
Yeah.
We were friends. And this went on for a few days. And my wife, Rainey, and a good friend of mine, Micah Hanks, was staying with us this was over the Christmas season. And they were so concerned about me, they were going to call somebody and say, they're coming to take me away, and find out what's wrong with him. And a good friend of mine, David Weatherly, who is a shaman, he's written many, many books. He calls me out of the blue on like day 4. And he says, Scotty, you know how I told you I would get messages sometimes through a song or a book or something? And he says, every now and then I'd get a spoken message. I'd hear it audibly. So I was sitting here in my office not 10 minutes ago, and I heard an audible voice that said, call Scotty. He says, I don't know what it was for. He says, so here I am. What's going on? And he also knew Philip. We talked a bit, and as soon as he started bringing that up, that weeping started, and I said, I can't stop this. What is going on with me? And we talked for a little bit, and then he said, I'm going to tell you one thing. I don't know why this is happening to you. He says, but I'm going to tell you something. You're going to go to Egypt for the first time next week, and it's going to change your life forever. So I can't tell you why or what or wherefore. After he told me that, it all stopped. The crying stopped. The emotions stopped. It was like on an esoteric level. It's funny. God in the Old Testament, esoteric things, they never just go, hey, Brian, go see Bill and tell him this message. It's always, hey, Brian, after you almost drown, I want you to go see this doctor, and this doctor is going to introduce you to his daughter, and you're going to get married, and she's going to bring you up to an old boyfriend who is somebody I wanted you to talk to. That's the way these things always seem to happen.
Oh, yeah.
That's what it was with David Weatherly. And so I went to Egypt, and I had this experience at the temple of Hatshepsut. Go look up anytime you want her temple in Luxor. And it's on this side of the Valley of the Kings. You go over the rocky crags, you're in the Valley of the Kings. And I'm at her temple, and I'm at the tomb of Senenmut. And my friend John was with me, and he, of course, has a different theory than mine. But
yeah,
I'm standing down here. There's this rough-hewn stairway that's carved down into this gully alongside what is now the main road, which would have been the processional way leading up to her colonnaded temple, which was on several tiers. So we're down there in this gully. It's basically a ditch. We're at the opening of the tomb of Senenmut, and it had been closed up by the archaeological team working on it. And we're going to go get coffee. And I said, just go, you guys go up. I'm going to stay here for a minute. And I stood there in the front of Senenmut's tomb, and I lit a cigarette. And I said, it was that casual. It was about noon in the afternoon. And I'm like, so, Senenmut, are you really Moses? Moses, are you Senenmut? Did you even exist the way we think you did? And lighting the cigarette, and it's like, not a physical feeling, a spiritual, just hits me out of left field. I drop the cigarette in the sand, and I'm weeping. And it's flowing down my face, just rolling off my face. And I remember I'm shouting out in this echoey little grotto. I'm yelling, what the F am I crying for? And what just happened to me?
Yeah.
And now, fast forward a few, and there was no answer at that time. I sat down, I journaled it. I had my little, leather book that I kept in my cargo pants, and I journaled about it. I dated it, Tomb TT 253, and all of this. And I get back home. About a month later, I'm back home. And I call my friend Philip, who had died. I call his widow. And I said, I was inviting her to come and speak at our next symposium. And I said, I never told you what happened to me when Philip died. And I told her, the weeping and the few days. And she goes, do you remember when we were at the symposium, we told you we were probably going to meet you and John in Luxor because we were writing a book in Luxor the same time you were going to Egypt. She said, do you know what that book was about? She said it was about the relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut. And she said, did you know that Philip believed himself to be a reincarnation of Senenmut?
Oh,
She
wow.
said, just like you get 100 people say that there were reincarnations of Cleopatra.
Oh,
She
at
said,
least,
I believe they're tiered. And she said, Philip believed he was a reincarnation of Senenmut. And that's why we were going to write this a book about their relationship. Remember, I told you in ancient times, there was all this speculation that Senenmut and the pharaoh Hatshepsut were shagging. They had a great reputation. They had a relationship going on. And that's even your scholars who are not biblical scholars will admit that. Although they won't go near saying they think Senenmut was Moses. And so she tells me this, and she says, when did you have this experience at the tomb of Senenmut? And I pull out my journal, and I say, well, this was February 4th of 2013. And she almost audibly gasped. She said, do you know what happened to me on that same day, around the same time? She said Philip's brother was leading a tour of Scotland and some things that had already pre-planned, and so he came and filled in for Philip. We're sitting in the hotel room having coffee, and on that very same day, very same time of day, noonish, Philip appears right in front of us. An apparition, reaches down, moves a cup on the table, and disappears. And I'm getting chills right now, retelling that story. And she said, I believe Philip was coming to you to tell you you're on the right track.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting. John's wife, who is the Swedish PhD, who was the head of their archaeological site, Gebel El Silsila, she told me, beautiful little Swedish woman, she said, Scotty, she says, here in Egypt, I'm a scholar. She says, back in Sweden, I'm a witch. And so we had some good times with that, but she was having things that would happen. I was having things that would happen. I caught a photograph at Saqqara, which is a totally different topic, but I think they're related, where I had a vision that same week.
Wow.
And and I'm not given to that stuff. I'm not, pardon me, anybody, I don't consider myself too weird and too off the deep end that I have.
That's why, because you're not into it, that's why it's happening. And that's cool.
Well, I was sitting at Saqqara. This is where the stepped pyramid of Djoser is. And there's a courtyard there. That was the old courtyard. And along either side of the courtyard were these little temples that have like Quonset huts, except they were built out of stone. Tall, with all these curved roofs going along. And there's rubble that they've got all laid out neatly in the courtyard, and you can tour through them. Just look at the rubble with the hieroglyphs. So I'm sitting there, and the stepped pyramid is over my shoulder. John and I were the only ones there. This is 2013. Other than the guardians who guard the site, they're villagers, and they all wear the long white or gray galabeas, so they look like long sleep pajamas. And so we're there, and we're kind of mucking around, and John's over there looking at hieroglyphs. I'm sitting on a stone, and again, a common theme on lighting a cigarette. And as I lit that cigarette, all of a sudden, everything changed. The whole world shifted. The courtyard was clean. There was no rubble. It was all raked out sand. The temples were all rebuilt. And coming out of the coves of each one of the tops of these temples was a long torch about 8 feet long, and they were all lit. And the sun was very low in the sky. Think December at 4:30, 5 o'clock. Shadows coming down. I could smell incense. I could hear chanting. And coming toward me, I'm sitting in the same place. Coming toward me is a line of what I identify as priests. They were bald, bare-topped white kilts, all carrying these little trays with jars on them and things. Coming toward me, chanting. And they take a turn to my right, about 20 feet from me, and start almost military fashion, one after the other, and march over to the other side to one of these other cove-top temples. And I blink, and I'm back in present day. All the rubble's there and all this, and again another uttered, "What the hef was that?"
I'm fooled.
And John and I talked about it for a while, and we didn't really understand what it was all about. Well, that's very interesting. Well, I'd gone from that spot where I was sitting over to one of the little porches that were built in ancient times in front of these cove temples, and took a picture back this way, took a picture that way toward the stepped pyramid, and then the other way. Well, that was 2013. In 2020, I had a friend that was going to Egypt, and she said, we're going to Saqqara. And I told the story about this vision before. And she said, can you tell me about it? And so on the computer here, I called up pictures those pictures I had taken. That here's Saqqara, here's a step pyramid. And as I'm looking, I said, back there, and I blow the picture up on the screen. I'm sharing my screen with her. I said, that's the stone I was sitting on when I saw this vision. And I scroll over to the left. I'm like, what the hell is that? And there's a figure, a human figure, in the bright daylight sun, solid black, where you could see just a little reflection off the shoulder, off part of the head, and it was like cut off here. This is part of the head, the shoulder, down the rib cage to the hip, and trails off to the leg, and a long arm with the hand and fingers. And it's, as I'm looking at it, it's emerging from, I'm standing on the porch and I'm looking back this way. And so I've got the long line of these cove-top temples is now at an angle because I'm looking this way. It's coming out from behind the rubble. And it would have been where it would have been placed on that rubble, standing at least 8 feet off the ground. And I'm seeing this for the first time 7 years after the fact. I'm like, what the hell is that? I've had this picture for 7 years and I've never seen this before. And I had all kinds of things have happened as a result. And now this is a whole other story all on its own, the things that have happened as a result of this.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know who Chris Conway is? He was the Scottish psychic who replaced Derek Acora on the Brit show Most Haunted, where all the women all screamed and everything and all that. And he was very good at what he did. He came to Egypt with us the next year. John and I brought a bunch of people back with us, and he sat right where I sat, and I said, something happened to me here. What are you picking up? I said, I don't want to tell you yet. I want to see if you pick anything up. And he says, I'm getting an Egyptian man, this and that about him. He was like higher up, like a physician or a something, Grand Vizier maybe. And he said he says he is attached to you because you think the way he thinks. And that he won't give you his name or anything until he knows he can trust you. And this is how this all went. And all this wild stuff happened from this character in this picture. And I brought up Senenmut. He said, I don't think it's Senenmut. But then we're back at a week later. We had taken a bunch of people with us to retrace John's and my expedition to write that book. And we're back at Hatshepsut's temple in Luxor. And Chris says to me, we're just standing out in front of the temple. He goes, Scotty, his Scottish accent. Scotty, I've got your man back. He's here. And he's offering you his name. He's offering you some other things that have nothing to do with the story, and it would just sidetrack it too big. And John, who was into the esoterics of all of this, was like, where did you get that name? And Chris said, this is the name he gave me. And so then all kinds of other things have happened as a result of that character. I'll tell you one little thing without getting too much longer on this topic, but I was with Rocky Stucci, a good friend of mine I did radio with, and John Ward, my late friend. And we're all driving. We're all up here in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And we wanted to go see this house that Rocky had been seeing and doing paranormal investigations at this house. He said, guys, this house is rich. It's over in the inner city lakes and all of this. That's the oldest house in the area, built in the 1850s.
Yeah.
Across the street from I think some kind of bagel shop. And one of those 4 square blonde brick apartment buildings, is next door. But it's an old historic site. And a woman lived in it that was on the city council, and she knew Rocky, and she had him do investigations there. So we're going to do an investigation there. And Rocky says there's a lot of stuff about this house. Old brothel, old military stuff from Fort Snelling up here in Minneapolis. And he says, why don't we all, we're going down the highway. Rocky's, New York, Italian heritage. So you got to talk like that, And he says, how about we all say a little prayer? Call on our spirit guides, whatever, as we're on our way to this house. So I pray, and I actually reach out to this Egyptian man. And I was told by Chris Conway, he said he will never leave Egypt, but he will always be attached to you when you come here. So I reach out. And I say, I don't remember his name. It was so complicated. And I said, you said you would never reach out to me or attach with me. I said, do you have the capability to do, can you hear my voice? And I'm feeling silly in my head while I'm saying these things. I said, if you're here and you can do that, let me know. I got my eyes closed. And very substantially, viscerally, I feel these arms go around my shoulders and my chest, the chin on the top of my head, like the old statuary, holding somebody of royalty. And I feel it in the car. And it just settles in. And I said, and there's more to it than that again, but
yeah,
I settle into that and I said, thank you. I think I know who this is. And so all of that, you start tying this, I've drifted way off. I rabbit trailed off of Senenmut there, but they're linked. They're linked because of the temples. They're linked because of the personages. They're linked because of history, the dating systems. Senenmut fits the date of Moses.
Absolutely.
Go by the biblical date. And so I think we've got a pretty solid case for
Oh, I agree.
Moses.
No, that's fascinating. There's so much more to go into, but in order for me to get the shorts out of this, I got to cut it short here so that we can get more. But you will be back for 2 more books. This is fascinating.
Anytime. You just ask. I'm around.
Oh, you shouldn't offer like that. I will take you up on that. I want to thank you so much. I'm going to put you in the green room, but don't go away. Wait till I close the show, okay? Okay. There's so much more to get into, and I so wish we had the time. Please read the book. It is probably one of the best books I've ever read, and you know me, I've read a lot of books. So check it out, and I will see all of you on Thursday when we do the free reading show.